Vancouver Island is a huge island in the Pacific Northwest just off the coast of British Columbia, roughly 3/5 the size of Nova Scotia, or 6 times larger than Prince Edward Island, making it the size of a province in its own right. A place of towering mountains and wild seascapes, Vancouver Island is also known for its sylvan beauty, which is sadly becoming ever more rare, as the island is increasingly subjected to massive overharvesting of its forests. In the past, the primary harvesters were small sawmills, but following the 1950s, both the United States and Canada gave contracts to large timber and pulp concerns, and some of them went on to conspire to drive prices down to force small timber operations out of business, much as we have seen in recent years on the eastern side of Canada. Possessing multi-generational contracts good for 50 years, having largely rid themselves of competition, and following having driven prices so low that they could purchase trees for less than the price of a hamburger, these large timber and pulp companies then went on to devastate and butcher the forests of the Pacific Northwest, of which Vancouver Island is a key part. On Vancouver Island alone, every single year, nearly 100 square miles of forest are cut down, and of that, almost a half is old forest. The forests of the Pacific Northwest contain the greatest concentration of biomass of any forest in the world, making them unique and potent carbon sinks. And larger, older trees are much more effective at storing carbon than young trees, a topic we will return to later in this video. But for the moment, we will focus on the fact that the destruction of this forest removes a vast amount of crucial carbon storage ability from the Earth's ecosystem, thereby having the effect of accelerating climate change. By and large, the massive companies behind this destruction have been able to keep the damage and harm to the ecosystem that they wreak out of the public eye, simply by dint of remoteness. Most of the cutting goes on where the public does not ordinarily travel, leaving people, in general, unaware. Even persons flying over the province will often be unaware of the full extent of the damage because at high altitude, where the larger civilian aircraft tend to travel, Clearcuts even a few years old can hardly be distinguished by the untrained eye from the surrounding landscape, especially during the summer or winter when things are uniformly green or white. But today we're going to conduct an aerial tour via bush plane from the small airports at Campbell River to Port Hardy, covering roughly 40% of the length of Vancouver Island, and using an amazing new technology called the Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020 to see just how extensive the damage to the forest ecosystem is. We will travel over coastal areas, inlands, and mountain ranges, where we will see that no place has been spared from the vast depredation of logging on an incomprehensible scale. Of the Pacific Northwest rainforest, ranging from Northern California all the way to the Alaskan Panhandle, an average of between 90 to 96% of the forest has been cut, and the industrial logging operations are now squabbling over scraps. Those scraps, however, are crucial, the last remaining vestiges of an important and perishable biodiversity bank. The Microsoft Flight Simulator has been around for decades and has been used to allow pilots to get their sim time in, but this latest iteration, often dubbed Microsoft Flight Sim 2020, is special because it does not merely simulate global terrain. Rather, as one uses it, it continuously downloads satellite and aerial images of a region, which it then translates into a three-dimensional perspective via a technology called Photogrammetry. What this means is that the landscape one sees through the Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020 is, in fact, what one would see if you were actually flying over that region. The flight simulator merely relates what aerial photography and satellite imagery show, so there is extreme fidelity between what the user sees and the landscape. Photogrammetry is not a perfect technology, and the Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020 has not even been around 6 months yet, so it makes a few errors here and there. The most common errors relate to sometimes misportraying the heights of buildings or misinterpreting water levels. The former is a rare bug that shows up now and then, and the latter most likely results from conflicting data about water levels which vary depending on the time of the year, rain, and snow runoff. In fact, in the latest patch for Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020, many of these issues were addressed. However, these issues rarely relate to what we will see in wild natural environments. In fact, the world is portrayed so accurately in the Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020 that pilots are able to practice a flight skill previously impossible to do in any meaningful sense in a mere flight sim. They are able to practice navigation by way of recognition of visual landmarks. What this means for you is that what you will see on this virtual flight is what is really there, and the world is portrayed accurately from the broken landscape of clearings and woods in front of us to that cumulonimbus cloud that looks like it wants to form into a storm head at 12 o'clock. So, we're not quite 15 kilometers outside of Port Hardy yet, but we're already starting to see the Clearcuts just ahead. Note that you don't see them in the immediate vicinity of the town though. As a rule, people don't like them. And the timber and pulp cartels have learned that the best way to keep something out of the public mind is to keep it out of sight. So in so much as possible, they try to keep their clearcutting operations outside of the view of the general public. So it is pretty typical that within a few miles of any small town, one will see an illusion of healthy forests. And the bigger the town or the city, the further out that illusion will extend. But once one gets into rural areas that are not likely to be frequented by a majority of people, the clearcuts, as you will soon see, begin in earnest. In fact, it's right about halfway across this lake that they're really going to get started. We have a moment till we get there, so I'm going to take this time to make some adjustments on the GPS and correct the plane's barometer, which is crucial for the altimeter, given the data that was relayed by air traffic control a couple minutes ago. When doing these virtual flight tours, I like to keep the flight as realistic as possible. So the sim's flight parameters, which includes things such as radio communication and air turbulence, are set to maximum fidelity. I do this so that you, in so much as possible, can experience this flight as if you were actually in a small aircraft traveling over that area. And with the ship's instruments adjusted, when we look off the left wing, we can see along the edge of the lake, up to the foothills, and beyond rising up into the mountains, the vast expanse of clearcutting that has already gone on, beginning just barely 15 kilometers outside of Campbell River. It's somewhat unintuitive for humans, who are by nature land-based animals, to understand imagery seen from the air, so let's take a moment to study how to interpret what you are seeing below. The pale brown patches are fresh clearcuts, usually done within the last 2 to 3 years, and the pale greenish patches are new but not fresh clearcuts. Those are places where herbaceous foliage is growing in thickly where once stood a forest. The dark green patches are older stands of trees. They could represent mature forests, but bear in mind, throughout much of the Pacific Northwest rainforest, between 90 and 96% of the forest has been cut. So more often than not, those dark green patches just represent places where the trees have become taller than the foliage that once filled the clearcuts. If you were to hike into those areas though, you would find thickly growing small trees, crowns of which cover a jagged landscape filled with stumps and ripped up deeply channeled soil that has endured long-term damage created by heavy forestry machinery. The pale silvery blue patches are bodies of water, and the thin pale, usually off-white lines one sees tracing throughout the landscape are small rural roads, usually old logging roads. And tiny, irregular clearings like one sees lower middle screen and up along the edge of the lake often represent rural settlements, such as meadows and farms, or small timber cuttings on private land. Once we start getting into the really high country, you'll also see many clearings near the peaks. By and large, those are rocky natural outcroppings and not representative of clearcuts. But as you'll soon see, almost everything else is. This entire landscape, in fact, this entire side of the island has been extremely cut over, and as you will shortly see, it will be hard to find a patch of forest that has not been damaged by industrial scale logging. I've adjusted the right GPS screen to show the route that will fly between Campbell River and Port Hardy. As you can see, this takes us from a lightly settled coastal area right over the high mountain peaks, where we will get an unobscured view of the deep and hidden mountain valleys. And then we will descend out of the mountains back into the coastal area as we approach Port Hardy, where we'll land. It's a partly cloudy day today, and there's a little wind turbulence, which will shake the plane around a little, but that's also part of flying in a small bush plane. And the low sun, rising in the east, will provide good shadowing over the landscape, helping us to perceive most clearly that vast expanse of clearcuts that are down there. Having crossed the lake, we've become surrounded by them, and by leaning as far back as I can into the plane's seat, you can see on both the right and left of the cockpit the light to moderate greens that indicate new clearcuts with herbaceous foliage, and moderately aged clearcuts with brushy half-grown trees. And once again, looking out the left window, we can observe clearcuts going up the side of the mountains to where their ridges disappear in cloud cover. And though the foolishness of it is mind-boggling, about half those clearcuts are old growth, just like you see illustrated in this article. It is mind-numbing to consider this, but nearly every square foot of ground you are seeing out that left window has been clear-cut. Some more recently within the last few years, and some as much as a few decades ago. But it's been clear-cut, and that's broken forest ecosystem down there, no longer able to efficiently perform its environmental roles of air and water purification, soil retention and enrichment, and scrubbing carbon from the atmosphere. Pulp and timber cartels have long spread the myth among the general public that cutting the forest is good because it gets old trees out of the way, allowing new trees to grow and capture carbon. But ecologists have long known that this is a myth, another one of the many sleights of hands that are used by the pulp and timber cartel to deceive the general public, for it is large, old trees that are truly crucial in carbon capture. As reported in this article in phys.org, older, large-diameter trees have been shown to store disproportionately massive amounts of carbon compared to smaller trees, highlighting their importance in mitigating climate change, according to a new study in Frontiers in Forests and Global Change. Researchers examined the above-ground carbon storage of large-diameter trees greater than 23 inches, or equivalent to greater than 53.3 centimeters, on national forest lands within Oregon and Washington. They found that despite only accounting for 3% of the total number of trees on the studied plots, large trees stored 42% of the total above-ground carbon within these forest ecosystems. What this means is that mature and old forests are far more effective at carbon capture than young forests. And this recent study is not the only study, only the newest, that has confirmed this to be a fact. But you might ask, and reasonably so, how old and established trees can possibly store more carbon than young, new trees growing? Wouldn't new trees need to consume a lot of carbon to maintain their growth? Well, the answer is in the mathematics, as revealed a bit later in the article. Quoting the highlights, if you think of adding a ring of new growth to the circumference of a large tree and its branches every year, that ring adds up to a lot more carbon than the ring of a small tree, explains Dr. Mildrexler. This is why specifically letting large trees grow larger is so important for climate change, because it maintains the carbon stores in the trees and accumulates more carbon out of the atmosphere at a very low cost. Put another way, a tree is going to grow one annual growth ring worth of growth per year. A large tree with established leaves and roots is going to need a lot more carbon to fuel the growth of that one ring, and it will have a large infrastructure already put in place to accomplish the task of harvesting that carbon from the atmosphere and sequestering it away in the form of cellulose. Sadly, though predictably, the pulp and timber cartels have not shown any concern for this fact. In fact, they have worked and pushed and lobbied to loosen the regulations on protected trees, making more old growth accessible to them. For traditionally, this is not an industry that acts with much forethought. They may think about replanting the trees they desire to harvest for decades down the line, at least in regard to their industry, but they do not think in terms of generations down the line in regard to the environment and everyone else. For we read in the selfsame article, in the Pacific Northwest region of the U.S., a 21-inch diameter rule was enacted in 1994 to slow the loss of large, older trees in national forests. However, proposed amendments to this limit would potentially allow widespread harvesting of large trees up to 30 inches in diameter, with major implications for carbon dynamics and forest ecology. Dr. David Mildrexler, who led the study, highlights, large trees represent a small proportion of trees in the forest, but they play an exceptionally important role in the entire forest community. The many unique functions they provide would take hundreds of years to replace. As we approach the Vancouver Island Mountains, several thousand feet below us, you see the irreparably scarred landscape that provides silent yet undeniable testimony to the pulp and timber cartel's utter disregard for the environmental impacts of their actions. For despite the science that has conclusively demonstrated the all-important role of forests as carbon sinks, scrubbers of dust and pollution from the air, and invaluable purifiers of water and retainers of soil, not to mention the crucial role of old forests as biodiversity banks, the forestry cartels have cut rampantly through this landscape. Every valley has been devastated, as you can see right down there below, and will see as we continue on this virtual flight, examining satellite imagery that is used to create the landscape that we can perceive. And there, at 12 o'clock, one can see that even the steep slopes of mountainsides are not safe from the depredations of the timber and pulp cartels. They have developed technology to get at almost everything. Whatever the service of the forest for maintaining our world, they simply are not worth the cash that they can get from cutting those forests now without regard for our children's tomorrow. The truth of which is portrayed in every square foot of this valley that has now disappeared behind a cloud. The land is rising quickly below us now, and clouds are beginning to pile up upon the flanks of the mountains. But even through them, the scarred landscape is clear and unmistakable. Whether the pale brown of a fresh clear cut exposing the earth to erosion, or the pale green of a somewhat regrown, slightly older clear cut, or the darker green of an immature forest trying to reassert itself after the land was previously victimized by clear cutting. From the depths of valleys and right beside rivers and streams and lakes, to the plateaus atop these foothills and near to the crest of the mountains ahead, all one can see is not a healthy forest, but a vast, scarred land, all of which has been ravaged by the avaricious, insatiable machine that is the timber and pulp cartels. And everywhere you look, even down there in these deep and remote valleys, which one might have thought to be hidden and safe, one can see innumerable logging roads tracing through the landscape, and the scarring of old clearcuts regrowing even alongside what one might think of as otherwise steep mountain slopes, too treacherous to be climbed. But over and over again, the timber and pulp cartels have shown that no place is safe, no place is sacred, and nothing the forest does can possibly be as important as the profit that can be obtained by ripping it out of the earth. We're moving out of the foothills and up into the real mountains now, so I'm going to adjust the autopilot to take us up to 8,000 feet. That will allow us to clear the peaks ahead by 1,000 feet or so, and give us some space and margin of error to deal with any turbulent winds that we might encounter along their heights. The air is also going to get a bit thinner, so I'll just take a moment to also adjust the fuel mixture and the RPM speed of the propeller. And now that we should be able to anticipate safely clearing those mountain ridges up ahead, let's return to the task at hand. Through the lower left side window, we can see evidence of a recent clear cut. There are more just in front of the aircraft also, but we can't see them just now because the nose is climbing, and so the horizon is hidden just below the front of the airplane. But off to the right, you can see the bare scarred earth of more clear cuts, and the pale green of clear cuts that are a few years old. In those areas, the native trees are gone and you see only herbaceous growth, and perhaps the emergence of young trees. However, as we noted in the article earlier, it will take centuries, literal centuries, for that forest to regrow properly, and once again become able to very effectively capture carbon. Looking a little further out of our left window, we can see that mountainside, and indeed the entire valley, is riddled with logging road traces, and the scars of fresh clear cuts. And even despite the fact the valley is in shadow, one can perceive the pale green between the fresh clear cuts that indicates newer clear cuts. That entire valley, like pretty much every valley you'll find in the Vancouver Island mountains, has been entirely cut over, from the upper reaches of the mountain sides to the edge of the watercourses below. In fact, you can see out there, center screen, where the mouse cursor is, switchback logging roads tracing down to more logging roads right beside the watercourse. And it is only here, in the highest, cloud-covered craggy peaks of the mountains, where the logging roads fail to reach. Of course, environmentally speaking at this point it makes little difference. The truly important areas for species conservation, soil retention and water purification, and that modern all-important factor of carbon sequestration is particularly reliant upon healthy forests, old forests, along the mountainsides where water runs, and down in the valleys where life is most active. Out the starboard side window there, that entire region has been cut over, everything you can see. Fresh cuts within the last few years, moderate cuts that might be 10 to 20 years old, and older cuts with some tree regrowth. But you will not see anywhere down there mature cuts that are able to play their environmental role in an effective way. The forest is just too young to effectively fulfill its role, a concept we'll take a look at more closely later on. And here we are pushing into the next valley, and you can see it's the same story all over again. The entire valley, from the heights of the mountain sides down to the river at its heart, has been cut over. Some very recently, some within the past few years, and some no more than a handful of decades ago. If a few decades sounds like a long time, it is important to bear in mind that in the lifespan of trees, a few decades is very little. In human terms, trees only a few decades old are no more than the equivalent of small children. They haven't even reached adolescence yet. And just as human children cannot be expected to perform their roles in society effectively, it is much the same with trees. Mature trees are able to perform their roles of conservation and environmental improvement because they have worked the soil and developed key relationships with the soil flora, particularly the mycelia or threads of fungi that are crucial in providing the trees nutrients and helping them defend themselves against pathogenic invaders. Mature forests also develop relationships with the local wildlife. They establish and retain soil, even going so far as to remove thousands of tons of dust from the atmosphere when the winds blow over them. And because they are bigger and have learned, yes, trees learned, to be far more effective at capturing carbon to feed the much more substantial needs of their annual growth, they are able to remove atmospheric carbon much more effectively. Immature trees, by contrast, must attempt to regrow after the land has been butchered through the process of clearcutting. Without the old trees to shelter them, they grow too fast and become weak, nor do they learn to develop defenses against pathogens and invading insects. And they must attempt to re-establish themselves upon a landscape that has been biologically depleted and diminished. For the earth over a clearcut is very prone to erosion, and there are no neighboring trees to shelter new trees from the wind. Odds are heavily stacked against the trees that attempt to grow in a clearcut, and even if they were never cut again, most would never have a chance at reaching maturity. It would take several successions of forests, a process taking centuries, to re-establish healthy woods. Looking ahead of the aircraft, you can see the highest heights of the mountains rising a few miles ahead, and the clearcuts that invade every valley and denude every mountainside are found even there, going up to the highest heights of those mountains, with the sole exception, as we have already noted, of the steepest, rocky, craggy tops, where there just are not enough trees to make it worth the effort to get to. And it is only in these places that the landscape itself is not riddled with logging access roads. As we come into the next valley, we can see that the previous, as well as the new one that we are entering, has been entirely cut over, in some places more recent, and in some places in the none too far distant past. This is a landscape that has been entirely stripped of its native forest cover. So widespread and detrimental is the forestry holocaust going on in British Columbia that it is truly rare to find any unharmed, true and whole functioning ecosystems. In British Columbia, some 60 million hectares are covered in trees, but only about 22 million hectares of that are suitable for logging. And everywhere that is, such as that valley below, have already been logged and are now being logged again. British Columbia's rampant, virtually unchecked logging has the entire province sitting upon the brink of an environmental precipice from which there can be no returning. For in that province, 64% of reptiles and turtles, 58% of ferns, 46% of dicot plants, and 45% of amphibian species are presently at risk. This is to say that more than 1,900 species throughout the province of British Columbia are presently at risk of extinction, and in many, if not most of those instances, continued logging of their wild forest habitat is the primary cause. These species are irreplaceable. Their role in the ecosystem is not fully understood, and once they're gone, they're gone. Yet the British Columbian provincial government has shown little, if any, intent to even slow down the pace of logging, while at the same time the timber and pulp cartels pushed to log more and more. And where the forests were cleared, tree plantations were replanted. These tree plantations are typically monocropped species, that is to say that unlike a natural forest, which has the benefit of possessing many different tree species, making the forest resilient to the invasion of pathogens, tree farms, like regular farms, are additionally susceptible. And when they are found by a pathogen or an insect that can prey on whatever those tree farm species are, they are hit hard. The clearcutting also weakens the forest in another way. As noted earlier, young trees need parental figures like human children. They need to be nursed and educated by their elders. In a natural forest, the old trees stand until time and age and the culmination of other factors such as a heavy snow or mighty rainstorm or illness brings down an aged tree here and there. But until then, the young trees spend a great long time growing beneath the shade of their elders. In an ancient forest, only a tiny percentage of sunlight reaches the ground, and trees, like all plants, depend upon sunlight to make their food, so the growth of young trees is much inhibited. And this is good for trees. The cellular structure of their cellulose, which is like the equivalent of the bones of trees, becomes small and dense, without space for air pockets and areas for pathogens to work their way in, hide, reproduce, and spread. And this initial very slow growth makes young trees durable, hardy, and they grow to be strong and resistant. These are the kinds of trees that can live very long lives and grow to be tall, long-lasting contributors to the forest ecosystem. But the old trees also educate the younger trees. Believe it or not, this is true. And it was Dr. Suzanne Simard who did the seminal research in this area. Old trees have seen and survived much. Over the many years of their long lives, if they live in dry areas, they have learned to conserve water. They have learned to recognize and deal with insect invaders and pathogens. And Dr. Simard discovered that these old trees, sometimes called grandmother or hub trees, shared this knowledge with other trees of the forest through an underground set of connections created by fungal threads called mycelia. When a forest is clear-cut, those grandmother trees are removed, and the new trees must grow up somewhat like orphans. And without the guidance of their elders, not only do they grow too fast, becoming large-celled and structurally weak, but they also don't learn how to maximize the potential of their immune systems. Thus, the forest, if one can call it a forest that regrows after a clear cut, will never have the potential of reaching the full mature strength of a forest that has known arboreal parents. Just off to the left, you can see a beautiful, what might appear to be hidden mountain lake, except that the clear cuts extend right to the very edge of that high mountain valley, and the pale and dark streaks within the valley incline me to think that it has been cut as well. And in fact, upon the mountain sides at equal height just behind, you can see the scars of fresh clear cuts. Everywhere you look, has been subject to the logging industry. Just look at the switchbacks of logging access roads, where the mouse cursor is pointing between the two wing struts. Yes, it's all been cut over. And there too, everywhere you look, you don't really see forest. Every single mountain and valley that is accessible has been cut. And so much of Vancouver Island is merely the wasteland of an industrial logging operation now. A beautiful and ancient forest, environmentally crucial, has been ripped away by unchecked logging concerns, and neither we nor our children will ever see such again. For it takes hundreds of years to establish such an ecosystem, and there is no guarantee, none whatsoever, that what grows back would even be like the forest that stood there before, nor any real chance of that, especially in areas where there are tree farms planted in the aftermath of clear cuts. All that can emerge from tree farms are monocropped collections of trees, much of their biodiversity removed, and with those trees, as we talked about previously, being weakened without hub trees or grandmother trees to teach them how to defend themselves against pathogens, and older trees to slow their growth and teach them patience. A collection of trees does not a forest make, and tree farms have often been described as mere green deserts. Canada, a geographically large country with a low population by comparison to other countries, is proportionately rich in wilderness and natural resources, and there is a long history in this nation of squandering those resources. Perhaps our country is just so big that we think what we have can never possibly end. And certainly in Canada, our governments and industries have long acted with incredible short-sightedness, typically aiming to maximize whatever they can get right now with very little thought to the future. And right along with that short-sighted style of thinking, our country has a long history of simply ripping resources out of the earth and selling them promptly for the fastest profit possible. Thus, historically in Canada, there has been very little thought to the long term of our natural resources, especially forests, nor has there been much in the way of thought toward maximizing the value of those resources. In light of this, despite the massive forestry operations in the province of British Columbia, one does not see much in the way of a prosperous outcome, And this can largely be attributed to the fact that the timber that is harvested within these invaluable rainforests is less and less processed into finished products within the country. And between 2000 and 2007, exports of raw logs have increased by 75%. Between the price fixing of large timber and pulp cartels in the 20th century to drive out small local competition, the lumber and timber cartels' ongoing battles to combat any kind of meaningful environmental regulation or responsible forestry practices, and an ongoing campaign of disinformation, often in the form of visually appealing though factually empty televised advertisements, I believe that it is exactly accurate to label Canada's pulp and timber concerns as cartels. They have in fact acted as such, with all the singular self-interest and corruption that one might associate with any other cartel. We're coming out of the mountainous region near the coast again, approaching the very small town of Port Hardy. So we'll be landing soon. I have just switched the tanks to balance out the aircraft's fuel, and in a moment I'm going to begin a slow, steady descent. But note, in this exterior view of the aircraft, once again, logging access roads and switchbacks and clear cuts in the form of fresh brown scars, the pale areas that indicate early to moderate age clear cuts, and the dark green areas that indicate partially regrown but unhealthy second growth forest. Everywhere that you look, as far as the eye can see. And honestly, I have seen no real difference between this landscape so near to Port Hardy and the much more remote and theoretically inaccessible landscape in the mountains. In point of fact, as we have noted already, look right down there in that valley, scarring in the depths of the valley and right up the mountainsides as far as it goes. Because, in point of fact, no place is safe from the depredations of the voracious lumber and pulp cartels of British Columbia. As we near the end of our virtual journey, I want to emphasize once again that though we are using a flight simulator to view the landscape, the Microsoft Flight Simulator draws its imagery directly from satellite and high-altitude photographic data. This is meant to allow pilots to practice visual flight skills while they're getting their sim time. But for our purposes, it means that what you are seeing from the aircraft is about exactly what you would see if you were to fly an actual aircraft over the region. The Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020 uses a technology called Photogrammetry to take that satellite and aerial imagery and translate it into a three-dimensional perspective. It does not invent the scenery that you perceive in this video. It simply relates what satellite data actually portrays, along with real-time atmospheric conditions and air traffic, so that the user of the application perceives almost exactly what is really there. If you were to jump into a small aircraft and fly the same route between Campbell River and Port Hardy, you would see pretty much the same thing that you've experienced in this virtual flight. There's another valley right down there, entirely denuded of forest, all along its sides and right down to nearly the edge of its river. But that really isn't surprising at this point, is it? This has been the case with every single valley that we have passed over. And as we get closer to Port Hardy, out of the window toward the left, at 11 and 12 o'clock, we can see a great deal of fresh brown scarring of new clear cuts. The GPS indicates we're about 25 miles from Port Hardy, so I'm going to begin a very slow descent now at just a few hundred feet per minute. I'll set the autopilot to handle the descent for us so that we can continue to focus on observation. Out to the right, we're beginning to see some islands that are clear of forests. I'm not sure if those islands are rocky and craggy given their exposure to the sea and are naturally clear of trees, or if they've been cleared by humans. I do see small structures on them, I'm guessing houses or maybe small farms. And while in many countries, agricultural operations are the primary contributor to deforestation, you may have observed that this is not the case in Vancouver Island. In fact, it is not the case in much of Canada due to our low population, but also the fact that so much of our country, so much of the soil simply is not suited to farming. In every place in Canada where I have observed and documented clear-cutting operations, The forests were not being destroyed to make way for farms. They were simply being clear-cut to suit the demands of pulp and timber cartels, and, at least on the east side of Canada, to feed so-called biofuel plants either domestically here in Canada or abroad, very often in Europe. Biofuel is another mess all unto itself. The delusion that it is somehow green and environmentally sound to cut healthy forest lands and burn them like coal. And a great deal of Canada's rare and unique, invaluable hardwood Acadian forests has already been sacrificed to the insatiable flaming maws of the biofuel plants of Atlantic Canada and Europe. Given the centuries that it takes to establish a healthy and mature forest, and the fact that one cannot reasonably expect a few inches of topsoil to sustainably meet the enormous energy demands of the modern industrial world, burning forests for biofuel is a delusion and a madness all unto itself. But that is a topic for another time and another video. Directly below us we see a landscape just outside of Port Hardy that has been entirely clear-cut. Every square foot that I see down there has been clear-cut sometime within the last few years, all the way to the horizon or the distant mountains out the port window. Often you see this type of thing stop a few miles out of town because the local population doesn't like to see it, and presently we're a little under 20 miles from Port Hardy. I imagine in the next 10 to 15 miles we're going to see this kind of clear-cutting come to a stop, so that at least at a level position from the ground, the town will appear to be surrounded by green and healthy forests. We're approaching the outskirts of the town now, and you can see here that the clearcuts seem to have stopped. Clearcuts are often kept behind cosmetic hedges, narrow bands of trees that are left standing to hide the ugly scars of clearcuts behind. No one likes to see them. Forestry and timber cartels are well aware that life is easier for them if they keep the harm that they do out of sight and out of mind, and they've become very, very good at the art of hiding their clearcut operations. In the Acadian forests of the East Coast, I've seen clearcuts conducted over the high rolling hills where cosmetic hedges were left standing in crisscrossing ways so that if one were to observe them from even as close as merely a mile away, it created the illusion that the entire forest was healthy and whole and still standing. And wherever you go in Canada, along any roads where many people are wont to travel, ubiquitous clearcuts are often to be found, though hidden, yet much closer than you might think. Here we see Highway 19 on the east side of Vancouver Island, also known as the Inland Island Highway, just a few kilometers south of Campbell River, from an altitude of about 11.3 kilometers. As with everywhere else on the east side of Vancouver Island, the entire landscape is a patchwork of clearcuts. But if we zoom in to about 2.5 kilometers over the landscape, where we get a good view of this well-traversed highway often used by tourists, you can see to either side of that highway narrow bands of what appears to be thick, lush, green, even untouched forest. These are cosmetic hedges left behind by the forest industry to conceal the clearcuts just behind them. But make no mistake, wherever you go, if you think you are in a forest, merely stop your vehicle, get out and walk 100 or 200 meters, and odds are extremely high you'll soon find yourself standing in a clearcut. As you can see, British Columbia's forestry operations are an epic failure when it comes to environmental conservation or any long-term thinking whatsoever. Alright, just up ahead, not even 2 kilometers away is our runway, and we are on the final approach. Very shortly we'll be landing. Thank you for joining me on this virtual aerial tour of the devastated forests of Vancouver Island. I know it's not easy to watch something like this, but I think it's imperative to bring what is going on in these forests to light. And this new technology, photogrammetry, which brings satellite imagery to life, has the potential to lay bare what the timber and pulp cartels have previously been able to get away with, or at least so they thought. Now, thanks to this new technology, there is no hiding it. There is still hope though. There is still forest that's worth preserving, and if effective conservation is legislated, there is a chance to restore so much of what is lost. But Vancouver Island and the rest of British Columbia are down to their last precious stands of old-growth forests. Those all-important banks of biodiversity, and the opportunity to save these beleaguered ecosystems and all the benefits that they do for us and the world around us is quickly vanishing. The time to act is now.